It was a crisp autumn morning in Phoenix, Arizona, when Officer James Richardson began his patrol shift like any other day. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the upscale Silverleaf neighborhood. His crisp blue uniform and polished badge reflected his 15 years of service, but lately, something had changed in him. The recent surge in crime reports had left him increasingly on edge, quick to judge, and perhaps too eager to assert his authority. At the corner of Maple Drive and Highland Avenue, a sleek black Mercedes caught his attention. The driver, a woman wearing a traditional hijab, was speaking animatedly on her phone in Arabic. Officer Richardson's jaw tightened as he watched her pull into the parking lot of the prestigious Phoenix Medical Center. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him, or perhaps it was his own prejudices clouding his judgment. The woman, Dr. Amira Hassan, stepped out of her car with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. Her designer briefcase and immaculate white coat suggested professionalism, but Officer Richardson had already made up his mind. He pulled his patrol car into the lot, lights flashing. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID and registration," he called out, his voice carrying an edge that made several passers-by stop and stare. Dr. Hassan turned, her expression calm but questioning. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Officer Richardson's response was curt. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Your vehicle matches a description." It was a lie, and they both knew it? Dr. Hassan's eyes narrowed slightly, but she maintained her composure. As she reached for her purse, Officer Richardson's hand instinctively moved to his holster. "Slowly," he barked, causing Dr. Hassan to freeze. The growing crowd of medical staff and patients watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. "Officer, I'm simply getting my identification," Dr. Hassan said softly, her voice steady despite the tension. "I'm the head of neurosurgery at this hospital, and I'm actually running late for an emergency procedure." Richardson scoffed. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. Let's see some real ID." His tone dripped with sarcasm and barely concealed prejudice. The crowd grew larger, and several people had their phones out, recording the interaction. Dr. Hassan slowly withdrew her hospital ID badge, her medical license, and her driver's license. "Perhaps this will help clarify things, Officer Richardson," she said, reading his nameplate. "I'm Dr. Amira Hassan, Chief of Neurosurgery, and in approximately 20 minutes, I need to be in operating room 3 to perform emergency surgery on a 6-year-old boy with a brain hemorrhage." Officer Richardson grabbed the documents roughly, his face flushing as he read them. But instead of backing down, his embarrassment fueled his anger. "These could be fake. You'll need to come with me to verify these documents." A voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary, Officer Richardson." The crowd parted as Hospital Director Dr. Thomas Crawford approached, his face stern. "Dr. Hassan is not only our Chief of Neurosurgery, but also one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. And right now, she has a critically ill child waiting for her expertise." The atmosphere shifted dramatically, but this confrontation was far from over. What happened next would not only change Officer Richardson's life forever, but would also spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire city. Officer Richardson stood frozen, his face reddening as Dr. Crawford's words hung in the air. The morning sun now illuminated the growing crowd of hospital staff, patients, and visitors who watched the scene unfold. Dr. Hassan remained composed, though her eyes held a mixture of disappointment and determination. "Officer," she spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. "I understand you're doing your job, but right now, my patient needs me. That young boy's life depends on the next hour." She turned to Dr. Crawford. "Thomas, please have operating room 3 prepped. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Before Officer Richardson could respond, another figure pushed through the crowd. A woman in her early 30s, tears streaming down her face, rushed forward. "Dr. Hassan, please! My son Tommy. They said you're the only one who can help him." Dr. Hassan's expression softened as she faced the distraught mother. "Mrs. Reynolds, I promise you, I'm going to take care of Tommy. I just need to finish up here." She turned back to Officer Richardson, her gaze unflinching. "Officer, you have two choices. You can either continue this unnecessary detention and explain to this mother why her son's surgery was delayed, or you can let me do my job." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Several phones recorded every moment, capturing Officer Richardson's internal struggle playing across his face. Dr. Crawford stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "James, I've known your family for years. Your father served on our hospital board. What would he say if he saw this?" The mention of his father hit Officer Richardson like a physical blow. Robert Richardson had been a respected figure in the community, known for his fairness and dedication to equal treatment for all. Now, standing in the hospital parking lot, Officer Richardson saw his own actions through his father's eyes. He started, his voice catching. Dr. Hassan was already moving toward the hospital entrance, her white coat billowing behind her. "Officer," she called over her shoulder, "if you want to verify my credentials, you're welcome to wait. Better yet, come watch the surgery. See for yourself who I really am." The invitation surprised everyone, including Officer Richardson. Dr. Crawford nodded approvingly. "An excellent idea. Officer Richardson, would you like to observe from our viewing gallery? It might be educational." 2 hours later, Officer Richardson stood in the observation room above Operating Room 3, watching in awe as Dr. Hassan's skilled hands navigated the delicate tissues of Tommy Reynolds' brain. Her movements were precise, confident, each action calculated and purposeful. The team worked in perfect synchronization under her leadership. "She's published in every major medical journal," a resident whispered beside him. "Last year, she developed a new technique for pediatric brain surgery that's being adopted worldwide. We're lucky to have her here." As the surgery progressed, Officer Richardson felt the weight of his earlier actions pressing down on him. The prejudices he'd carried, the assumptions he'd made, they all seemed remarkably small compared to the skill and dedication he was witnessing. But the most profound moment was yet to come. What Dr. Hassan would do next would not only challenge Officer Richardson's worldview, but would also teach him a lesson in humanity he'd never forget. Through the observation window, Officer Richardson watched as Dr. Hassan completed another intricate part of the procedure. Her hands moved with remarkable precision, each movement deliberate and focused. The operating room staff worked in perfect harmony, anticipating her needs before she even voiced them. "Blood pressure's dropping," one of the nurses announced. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Dr. Hassan remained steady, her voice calm but authoritative. "Push one of FPI, we're almost there." Her confidence seemed to ripple through the team, steadying everyone around her. In the observation room, Officer Richardson felt his phone vibrate. Looking down, his stomach dropped. The morning's incident had already gone viral. Videos from multiple angles showed his confrontation with Dr. Hassan, and social media was erupting with outrage. Local news stations were picking up the story, and his department chief had left 3 missed calls. But watching Dr. Hassan work, none of that seemed to matter as much as the life hanging in the balance below. A young resident next to him whispered, "Watch this part. She's using the technique she developed. Most surgeons wouldn't even attempt this approach." Down in the operating room, Dr. Hassan was explaining each step to her team, teaching even as she worked to save Tommy's life. "See how the vessel curves here? Traditional approaches would avoid this area entirely, but by coming in at this angle." Her words were precise, educational, showing no sign of the morning's confrontation affecting her focus. Suddenly, the machines began beeping rapidly. "He's seizing!" called out the anesthesiologist. The observation room fell silent as they watched Dr. Hassan handle the crisis. Her response was immediate, decisive. She didn't just work through the complication, she turned it into a teaching moment for her team. "This is why we maintained that margin earlier," she explained calmly, her hands never hesitating. "Now we can safely—" Her voice trailed off as she concentrated on a particularly delicate maneuver. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Officer Richardson found himself leaning forward, his heart racing as if he were down there himself. He thought about Tommy's mother in the waiting room, about how his own actions could have delayed this critical surgery. The weight of his prejudice felt heavier with each passing minute. A nurse entered the observation room with a folder. "Officer Richardson, Dr. Hassan asked me to bring you these while you wait." Inside were copies of her credentials, her medical degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, her numerous awards and publications, and letters of recommendation from some of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world. But what caught his eye was a photograph paper-clipped to the back. It showed Dr. Hassan in military fatigues, treating wounded soldiers in a dusty field hospital. The caption read, "Dr. Hassan, U.S. Army Medical Corps, Baghdad, 2019. His hands trembled slightly as he read the accompanying citation. Not only had she served her country, but she'd also received a Bronze Star for saving an entire unit under heavy fire. The same hands that were now saving Tommy's life had saved countless American soldiers in the field. Just then, Dr. Crawford entered the observation room. "Officer Richardson, there's something else you should know about Dr. Hassan. The reason she was in such a hurry this morning." He paused, making sure he had Richardson's full attention. "She was rushing here because Tommy isn't just any patient. His father is Captain Michael Reynolds, currently deployed in Afghanistan," Dr. Crawford revealed, his voice heavy with meaning. "Dr. Hassan has been personally monitoring Tommy's condition since the symptoms first appeared, coordinating with military medical units to keep his father updated." Officer Richardson felt the air leave his lungs. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he had profiled and harassed an American veteran, she had been racing to save a soldier's child. Down in the operating room, Dr. Hassan's voice cut through his thoughts. "Beginning final closure now. Excellent work, everyone." The procedure had lasted over 3 hours, but she showed no signs of fatigue. If anything, her movements were as precise as when she started. A new figure appeared in the observation room, a military officer in full-dress uniform. Colonel James Wright, the base commander from nearby Luke Air Force Base, nodded curtly to Officer Richardson before turning his attention to the surgery below. "Dr. Hassan has been instrumental in our veteran care program," Colonel Wright said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "She's developed specialized treatments for traumatic brain injuries that have saved dozens of our soldiers. When she's not here, she volunteers at the VA hospital twice a week." The machines in the operating room began showing stable vital signs. The tension in everyone's shoulders visibly relaxed as Dr. Hassan stepped back from the table. "Surgery successful," she announced to her team. "Tommy's going to make it." The observation room erupted in quiet applause, but Officer Richardson couldn't bring himself to join in. The shame of his actions pressed down on him like a physical weight. As Dr. Hassan began to close, she looked up at the observation window, making direct eye contact with him. Her expression wasn't angry or triumphant. Instead, it held something that made him feel even worse: understanding. As she left the operating room, Dr. Hassan spoke quietly to her team, but the microphones picked up her words. "Remember, we never know someone's full story. Every patient, every person deserves our best, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Tommy was wheeled to recovery as doctor. Hassan made her way to speak with Mrs. Reynolds. The joy and relief on the mother's face as she received the good news made Officer Richardson's earlier actions seem even more shameful. He watched as Mrs. Reynolds hugged Dr. Hassan tightly, tears streaming down her face. Just then, a tablet in the waiting room lit up with an incoming video call. On the screen was Captain Reynolds, his combat gear dusty, having waited through the entire surgery to hear about his son. Dr. Hassan took the tablet, speaking with him personally about the procedure's success. The next moments would reveal even more about Dr. Hassan's character, and Officer Richardson was about to learn that the morning's confrontation had set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the entire community's perspective on prejudice and judgment. After speaking with Captain Reynolds, Dr. Hassan made her way to the observation room. Officer Richardson stiffened as she entered, but her expression remained professional and calm. "Officer Richardson," she said, her voice steady, "would you walk with me?" They moved through the hospital corridors in silence, passing nurses and doctors who couldn't hide their curious glances. Finally, Dr. Hassan led him to her office, a modest space filled with medical journals, awards, and children's drawings from grateful patients. "Please, sit." She gestured to a chair. On her desk, a photo caught his attention. Dr. Hassan standing with a group of military veterans, all smiling. "That was taken at our last Veterans Support Group," she explained, noticing his gaze. "We meet every Thursday evening. Many of them suffered traumatic brain injuries in combat." Officer Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dr. Hassan, He began, but she raised her hand gently. "Before you continue," she said, pulling out a folder, "I want to show you something." She opened it, revealing police reports. "Last month, your department responded to a domestic violence call. The victim was an Arab woman. According to the report, she refused medical treatment and wouldn't press charges." Officer Richardson remembered the case. The woman had been terrified, barely speaking to the responding officers. "She came to me instead," Dr. Hassan continued. "Not as a doctor, but as someone she felt she could trust. She was afraid, not just of her abuser, but of law enforcement. She believed no one would help her because of who she was." The weight of these words hung heavy in the air. Dr. Hassan leaned forward slightly. "Officer Richardson, this morning wasn't just about you and me. It's about trust. It's about breaking down barriers that prevent people from seeking help when they need it most." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in. "Dr. Hassan, they need you in the ER. There's been a major accident on the highway." Dr. Hassan stood quickly, but before leaving, she turned to Officer Richardson. "Would you like to see what I really do? Not just in the operating room, but in the moments when split-second decisions mean the difference between life and death." The invitation surprised him, but he found himself nodding. As they hurried toward the emergency room, neither of them could have predicted how the next few hours would unfold, or how a crisis situation would force them to work together in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about each other. The emergency room was chaos when they arrived. A multi-car pileup had left several victims in the critical condition. Dr. Hassan immediately took charge, her authority clear as she assessed patients and delegated tasks. Officer Richardson stood back, watching her work with the same precision he'd witnessed in the operating room. "Officer," she called suddenly, "I need your help." A badly injured man was fighting the medical staff, delirious from pain and trauma. Without hesitation, Richardson stepped in, using his training to calm and stabilize the patient, while Dr. Hassan administered crucial treatment. For the next 3 hours, they worked side by side, Dr. Hassan saving lives while Richardson assisted, witnessing firsthand how she treated every patient, regardless of their background, with equal dedication and respect. Her earlier words about trust and barriers echoed in his mind as he watched her switch effortlessly between English, Arabic, and Spanish to communicate with patients and their families. As the crisis subsided, Dr. Hassan pulled Richardson aside. "There's someone else you should meet," she said, leading him to a quiet corner of the ER. There, a young police officer sat with a bandaged arm. Officer Kevin Martinez, one of the first responders to the accident. "Dr. Hassan saved my mother's life last year," Martinez said, his voice full of emotion. "Brain tumor, other doctors had given up, but she didn't. Now my mom watches my kids every weekend." He looked directly at Richardson. "I saw the video from this morning. "That's not who we are, man. That's not what the badge means." Richardson's throat tightened. The day's events washed over him, from his prejudiced assumptions in the parking lot to witnessing Dr. Hassan's unwavering dedication to every life she touched. He turned to her, his voice thick with remorse. "I didn't just misjudge you," he admitted. "I betrayed everything this uniform should stand for. I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right." Dr. Hassan considered him for a moment before responding. "Then, help me build bridges. Next week, I'm starting a community outreach program, bringing together law enforcement, medical professionals, and community members to break down these barriers. We need officers who understand the importance of this work." 1 month later, Officer Richardson stood before a crowded community center, sharing his story alongside Dr. Hassan. The video of their confrontation had indeed gone viral, but not for the reasons originally feared. Instead, it became a powerful teaching tool about confronting prejudice and choosing understanding over assumption. The program they created together, Building Trust, Saving Lives, became a model for other cities. Dr. Hassan continued her groundbreaking work at the hospital while helping train police officers in cultural awareness. Richardson, now dedicated to community policing, worked to change the culture from within his department. As for Tommy Reynolds, he made a full recovery. The day he was discharged, his father surprised everyone by walking into the hospital in full uniform, having been granted emergency leave to be with his son. The photo of Captain Reynolds embracing Dr. Hassan while Officer Richardson looked on became a symbol of hope and change for the entire community. Dr. Hassan's final words to the community center audience resonated far beyond that room. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it starts in a hospital parking lot with two people willing to look past their first impressions and see who they really are. The story of the officer who learned to see beyond prejudice and the doctor who chose teaching over anger became more than just a viral moment. It became a reminder that beneath our assumptions and fears, we all share the same humanity. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful messages of hope and understanding. Remember, it only takes one moment of courage to begin breaking down the walls that divide us.